a long-standing franchise like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, there have naturally been quite a few film adaptations for the iconic heroes in a half-shell. After the incredible success of the 1987 animated series, a new version of the Turtles was created for the big screen and premiered in theaters on March 30th, 1990. Today, there are 10 film adaptations of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles to watch and enjoy. But, as with all things, not all movies are created equal. So which of these 10 films are the best, and which missed the mark? Let's get into it. At number 10, I have Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3 from 1993. Before I watched all of the films, I had already heard several people say that TMNT 3 is a terrible film and a disgrace to the original 1990 movie. And while I do agree that it is the worst of the TMNT films, it is not a bad movie. This film does some really fun things with its characters. I'm glad April was able to play a big role in the story again when she was sort of sidelined in Secret of the Ooze. Although Casey Jones doesn't contribute to the main narrative much, it was an absolute delight to see him return, plus Elias Koteas still got to be a big part of this movie by playing Casey's doppelganger Wit. I especially adore Yoshi's role in this story. Mikey and Leo saving him from the fire is a pivotal moment that gains them the trust of the village. Yoshi's story could have easily been left at that, but they instead bring him back to build a relationship with Raph. The way that Raph plays a sort of father figure role for Yoshi, encouraging him to play and have fun instead of thinking about war and fighting, is so wholesome and my personal favorite part of this movie. I also think the general plot of this movie is solid, with the Turtles needing to go back in time to save April and then deciding to help the village once they get there. Walker also makes a compelling antagonist. The way he is only involved in this conflict so he can exploit Norinaga for gold, and his general demeanor makes him such a cheesy yet iconic villain. Plus he's a bird dad, which I think is just fun. Although some of the comedy in this movie doesn't really work and resorts to the silly slapstick that I personally don't find entertaining, there are definitely some really funny moments that stand out to me.
Wait! I'm really a beautiful princess in disguise! Oh, sort.
But this film is the weakest of the 10 for a reason. First things first, these suits. They look better once they've gone back in time and are decked out in the samurai gear, but they are terrifying. The eyes and mouths are so wide, the spots on them make it look like they're diseased. They look lifeless and are just nowhere near as good as the original suits. Splinter also looks a little bit weird, but not as viscerally as the Turtles do. As much as I enjoy April being prevalent once more, some of her choices in this movie are a bit weird. Like when she is accused of being a witch and is surrounded by a bunch of men with weapons that want to kill or imprison her because they think she is a witch, she decides to claim to actually be a witch?
Yeah, it's true. I am a witch.
And then tries to trade away her Rolex to escape imprisonment, as if a Rolex would hold any value for these people that thought her Walkman was magic. However, one of my biggest issues with this film is the end scene where Mikey and Raph are like, actually, what if we didn't go back to the present? What? Like, Raph I give a little bit more credit because he bonded with Yoshi and there's the whole concept of being accepted by these people and not needing to live in the sewers. But then Mikey agrees with him for seemingly no reason. Like, he thinks Mitsu's cool and all, but they had one very brief conversation where she talked about missing Kenshin, so this turnaround makes no sense to me. It just adds some unnecessary last-minute tension, especially since the movie ends so abruptly once they get back to the future. Overall, it's a solid movie, but definitely has some very noticeable flaws that make it the worst of the TMNT films. In ninth place is the live-action Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles film from 2014. There's a lot of things this movie does really well, and other things it does less well. Right off the bat, the biggest strength of this movie is its action sequences. The mountain sequence especially is such a fun scene to watch. It's super high energy and exciting, and a great example of where this film shines. While I have seen some people claim that the Turtles don't feel like teenagers at all in these movies, I highly disagree. Their big, bulky designs definitely don't read as teenagers. However, their dialogue and the way they interact with one another as brothers absolutely comes across as adolescents. I also adore Raph in this movie and its sequel. The confession scene where they're all about to die perfectly highlights the nuances of his character that makes him one of my favorite versions of Raphael. I'm also a huge fan of the Turtles' backstory in this universe and how it not only connects them to the main antagonists, but April as well. It ties all of the characters together really nicely, which is unfortunately something we don't see executed well in the sequel. Although the fact that Splinter and the Turtles learn ninjutsu from from a random book they found lying in the sewers aggravates me to no end. Since they have the connection to Eric Sachs and the Shredder incorporated into their backstory, I'm a bit more forgiving compared to Mutant Mayhem Splinter, which I will obviously get to when we reach that film. One of the biggest issues with this movie that I had in the past was the portrayal of April O'Neil, and I am on record saying that I hate this version of April.
You know who is the worst version of April? Megan Fox. First F tier. I hate the way she's portrayed.
However, upon rewatching the film, I actually don't mind her that much. I do stand by my opinion that I don't think Megan Fox was the right choice for this role, and she is the worst April in the franchise. But I love her backstory and how it is reminiscent of the IDW origin story for the Turtles, and I think focusing on April to kick off the plot like they do in the 1990 live-action film is a really solid way to drive the story. I also love how focusing on April allowed Vernon Fenwick to be brought back. Something that I desperately want to see incorporated in some other iteration of TMNT is the Channel 6 crew from TMNT 87, and this movie is the closest we get to having all four of them. Plus, they adapted Vernon almost perfectly. The only thing I don't like is how they had him being romantically interested in April when I see his dynamic with April in the 1987 series as more of a sibling dynamic. But Will Arnett captures the pathetic little man energy very well. Although this movie excels at all of the things I have mentioned previously, it still has a lot of issues. First of all, the sexualization of April. It's not as bad as the way that Megan Fox is sexualized in the Transformers movies, but there are a couple of moments that gross me out, and Mikey's obsession with her being his primary personality trait is obnoxious. Some of the dialogue also isn't the best written.
We will drain every last ounce of their blood to get it, even if it kills them.
Yeah, that's what draining all of their blood would do, Sachs. Speaking of Eric Sachs, there's a sort of meta issue that I have with this film that taints it slightly for me, and that is the fact that Eric Sachs was created as a whitewashed version of Orokusaki and was originally going to be the Shredder. Fortunately, after people were rightfully upset about this change, they added in Orokusaki to be the Shredder in this movie. Although this does make some moments feel a bit off as a result of this last-minute change, it was absolutely the right choice and was incorporated relatively seamlessly. I never would have picked up on it if I hadn't been told about it, but it's still an ick that I will always associate with this movie. In 8th place is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2: The Secret of the Ooze from 1991. Funnily enough, prior to rewatching all of the movies for this ranking, I had Secret of the Ooze in my top 3 TMNT films. I don't like it any less upon rewatching it, but it doesn't stand up to the other TMNT movies quite as well as I initially thought. I don't share the same gripes that a lot of people have with this movie about it being too silly or way goofier than the first movie, because they simply aren't true. The difference in tone between the 1990 film and Secret of the Ooze is not that Secret of the Ooze has that much more silly moments in it, but that the 1990 film was balanced out with a more serious and emotional narrative that isn't as present in Secret of the Ooze. In both cases, the lighthearted shenanigans of the brothers are delightful and make the films really fun. Another common gripe with Secret of the Ooze is that the turtles don't use their weapons, which also isn't true. We do see the turtles use their weapons environmentally quite a bit and even directly against their enemies. I think this misconception comes from Mikey using the combat cold cuts in the opening and Leo not using his swords to cut himself and the turtles free from the trap they get caught in, but otherwise it's completely unnoticeable. Additionally, the fighting in this movie is still very solid, and Kino especially is very fun to watch. Although I don't really like Kino as a character, mainly because he doesn't contribute a whole lot personality-wise, and he doesn't leave a good first impression.
Dream on, dweeb.
When I do, I'll dream of something a little thinner.
I do really enjoy seeing him fight, and the fact that the character was created after working with him on the first film is really sweet. Professor Perry is a pretty neat character. He's a fun ally for the Turtles and ties into their origin a little bit through his connection to TGRI. Speaking of, I love how we learn more about the Turtles' origin, and it gives Donnie a really interesting arc with his whole existential crisis. I wish April did more in this movie. She has such a huge role in the first film, but doesn't really do much in Secret of the Ooze. Plus, Casey isn't in this movie at all, which is a tragedy. I'm not really a fan of this version of Shredder, which I will expand upon when we get to the 1990 movie, so bringing him back was kind of irritating for me. Especially because he wasn't killed by the garbage truck incident, but was killed by a dock falling on him when he was mutated to be super strong. I'm pretty indifferent when it comes to Toka and Razar are, they don't really contribute much beyond being pawns for Shredder's plans. Something this film does very well are the Turtles' shenanigans. They have some very fun moments of them goofing off with one another, which overall makes this movie a very fun watch. This is especially apparent in the ninja rap scene. This whole sequence is a delight. Unfortunately, they do feel a lot less sneaky and like ninjas compared to the first film, which is especially apparent in the scene where Kino immediately clocks Raph's hiding place compared to the way they stayed hidden from April's boss in the first movie. In general, this is a fun movie and a really solid sequel to the first film, but it doesn't carry the same weight and emotion and isn't as engaging from a narrative perspective as it could be. Though it does have this moment which lives rent-free in my brain.
Where's Splinter?
He's been up on the roof ever since he saw your report.
Doing what?
Coming.
At number 7 is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Out of the Shadows from 2016. For most of the films on this list, I enjoyed them even more upon rewatching them. However, this was the one film that I enjoyed less upon the rewatch. One of the things that makes this such a fun movie for TMNT fans is the fact that it introduces several characters from throughout the franchise. Unfortunately, the addition of all of these characters makes the cast of this movie feel incredibly cluttered. The first movie only had 3 antagonists: Eric Sachs, the Shredder, and Karai, and even then Karai was a supporting character and Eric Sachs and the Shredder were originally the same person. Out of the Shadows, on the other hand, has 6 antagonists. Shredder and Karai returning from the first film with the introduction of Baxter Stockman, Krang, and Bebop and Rocksteady. Because there are so many antagonists fighting for the spotlight in this film, most of which are new to this universe, it makes it difficult to justify their inclusion. I think the best example of where this film falls short when it comes to its antagonists is the way that they handled the Shredder and Krang. Orokusaki is broken out of jail and only serves as a pawn for Krang to make his way to Earth and take over the planet. This makes the Shredder's role feel quite minor, especially when he has minions doing his bidding, and even more so when he's immediately defeated by Krang toward the end of the film. But what arguably makes it worse is that Krang, who is supposed to be the main antagonist, the BBEG of this movie, only appears at 2 points in the film. When we first meet him and he dumps a bunch of exposition on the Shredder, and at the very end for the Technodrome fight. Somehow they make him feel unimportant despite him being the driving force of the plot. The other TMNT character that was added to this movie that I haven't mentioned yet is Casey Jones, and I hate the way that he's portrayed in this film. The fact that they made Casey Jones a cop is so unbelievably antithetical to who he is as a character, and his personality in this movie just feels kind of boring in general. I think having Casey start with the police and then realizing that he's not really a fan of the structure and going off to be a vigilante on his own has potential to be a really interesting character arc for him, but they didn't go that direction at all.
That's Officer Jones, and I'm gonna be a detective someday.
Despite the cluttered cast and storyline, there are a lot of things that I adore about this film. Bebop and Rocksteady absolutely carry this movie and are the best on-screen adaptation of them in the franchise. They remind me heavily of their IDW equivalents, where they are unapologetically chaotic and violent dumbasses. I also think the dialogue for the Turtles specifically in this movie is fantastic. There are some moments that I find really funny and make this version of the Turtles that much more likable.
Whoa, they've achieved the power of flight. Good for them, you know?
They're on a plane, Mikey.
Huh.
Except for Leo, I thought he was really annoying in this movie, and I don't think they handled the resolution of the conflict between him and his brothers particularly well, but that's a minor issue. Although the plot is a bit less focused and streamlined compared to the first film, the more open-ended nature of this movie makes it a lot more fun and lighthearted, and is a tone that works better for a movie like this. And of course, like with the first film, a lot of the action sequences are phenomenal and so fun and exciting to watch. As a fan of the franchise, this movie is a blast and a definite step up from the first film. However, for someone who isn't as familiar with the franchise, it's probably a lot less engaging with all of these new random characters thrown into the story that don't have any prior significance to them. It's not as accessible to the first film in that regard. However, I do think Out of the Shadows is a better movie overall. In 6th place is 2007's animated film TMNT. The 2007 film was the second TMNT movie I ever watched, and at the time, the only other TMNT media I had consumed prior was Rise of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and the 2012 animated series. Though I did enjoy it at the time, it didn't particularly stand out to me. However, properly rewatching this movie a dozen iterations and over a year later, I absolutely adore it. Raph and Leo's rivalry is a staple of the franchise and is practically a constant. To me, this film does the best job of explicitly exploring their dynamic and the ways in which both of their stances are problematic. Setting the movie a few years after the defeat of the Shredder, where the Turtles are no longer in their heyday and all of them are struggling to keep it together, is a really interesting approach and makes the exploration of Raph and Leo that much more compelling. The combat in this movie is insanely fun to watch, especially the iconic rooftop fight between Raph and Leo. In the past, I've said I didn't particularly care for the main narrative of the film with Max Winters and the 13 Monsters, but upon rewatching, I found that my stance has changed. While I still do feel the antagonist catching the 13 Monsters is arbitrary and not particularly compelling, Winters is a fascinating character, and setting him up as the antagonist before realizing at the end he's simply trying to reverse his curse is actually quite interesting. I also noticed some parallels between Raph and Leo's conflict and that of Winters and the Stone Generals. I'm planning to make a whole video analyzing this film and Raph and Leo's conflict, so stay tuned for that. My main issue with this movie is not that it necessarily does anything I dislike, but it doesn't really attempt to do a whole lot. It is incredibly focused on Raph and Leo, and it excels in that regard, but that's about it. April, Casey, Mikey, and Donnie don't really contribute to the film much beyond helping move the plot forward, and we only barely get a sense of their personalities. I think this is also due to the fact that this film was originally going to have sequels in which the other Turtles would have been explored more, but that unfortunately never came to fruition. I heavily debated the placement of the 2007 film relative to Out of the Shadows because the issues I have with them are essentially opposite. Like I mentioned earlier, Out of the Shadows tries to do a lot, which makes the plot and characters feel pretty convoluted at times. TMNT, on the other hand, is very grounded and focused on the story it wants to tell with Raph and Leo, which means it excels at that narrative, but neglects the other characters, especially Mikey and Donnie. I ultimately decided to put 2007 above Out of the Shadows because the issues that I have with it are the lack of something additional as opposed to in Out of the Shadows, where there is the presence of things that I find to be actively weak. At number 5, I have Netflix's Rise of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the movie from 2022. This movie is absolutely gorgeous. As with the series itself, the animation of the Rise movie is top tier and it has the best fight sequences in the entire franchise. It's impossible for me to showcase just how incredible this movie looks without showing the entire movie. It is absolutely stunning. Beyond the visuals, it's difficult for me to talk about what this movie does really well without also addressing some of its shortcomings because they go hand in hand. The best example of this is Leo's characterization and arc throughout the film. What is probably my biggest issue with this movie is how obnoxious and annoying Leo is at the start of the film. He's more dismissive and overconfident here than he is at any point in the animated series. It makes it feel like they completely backtracked on some of his development from the series for the sake of the movie, which I am not a fan of. My guess as to what they were going for here was that since being appointed leader, Leo's kind of been in his own head and unsure of himself, so he's been overcompensating by acting super ridiculously full of himself. However, they never address Leo being the new leader of the team at all during this movie, and it feels like Raph still sort of has that role with the way that he directs the team at the start. All of that said, Leo's character arc and where he ends up at the story's conclusion is really enjoyable. Raph being captured and Leo's determination to get him back and reconcile with his mistakes is heartwarming, and the scene where they get their mystic powers back is beautiful, both visually and emotionally. Another example of this two-sided coin is the Krang. I've said in the past that I don't like this version of the Krang because I don't like how they're depicted as these strong brutes that are insanely overpowered. Although my reason for disliking them hasn't changed, I think it's outweighed by how cool they are otherwise. This film focuses on the alien abilities of these creatures more than any other version of the Krang or Utrom, which makes them absolutely fascinating. They can lock away mystic powers, read minds, infect hosts like Raph and the citizens of New York, take over buildings and vehicles by spreading their Krang goop, and their Technodrome is the most unique by being an organic piece of technology. All of these abilities are cool on their own, but they lend themselves to some really cool animation sequences as well. One last gripe that I have is I don't like Casey Jr. as a character that exists in this universe. Now, I don't mean that I dislike him as a person. He's fine enough and he has some fun little moments, but only serves as a plot device and takes over as the Rise universe's version of Casey Jones for this movie, which really irritates irritates me because we only got the actual Casey Jones of this universe for one episode of the series, and she only gets a brief cameo at the end of the movie. I would be more okay with Junior's introduction if his personality was more similar to his mom's, or if he had that classic Casey himbo energy, but he's really generic and boring. This ties to a minor issue that I have with the film in general, and that is that we don't really get to see other characters from the Rise universe highlighted, such as Baron Draxum. However, I understand why they leaned away from Rise exclusive characters for this movie, and we still got an appearance from Warren Stone and Hypnopotamus, which was fun. Overall, this movie is kind of slow at the start, but picks up to an incredibly fun, high energy, and emotional conclusion on top of its phenomenal animation throughout. At number 4 is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem from 2023. When I first watched this movie last year, I was a bit underwhelmed, but that was mostly because a lot of what makes this movie so fun and iconic had already been shown in promotional footage and trailers. Properly sitting down and rewatching the full movie again, however, it was an absolute delight. First of all, like with the Rise movie, this film is gorgeous. The art style they chose for this movie is perfect. I love how they deliberately wanted it to look like something teenagers might scribble in a notebook. The mix of 2D and 3D is masterfully done. The animation itself is phenomenal too, especially when it comes to the fight sequences. One of the highlights of this movie is the fighting montage. It is an absolute blast to watch and arguably one of the best sequences in the entire franchise. The voice acting in this movie is also phenomenal, from the celebrity voice actors to the turtles themselves. Speaking of, the teenage brother dynamic in this movie is incredibly accurate. The way they play off of one another is an absolute delight to watch. They do a really good job of highlighting their inexperience in working together as a team at the start of the movie when they confront the guys who stole April's scooter, and how they grow together by the end of the film. I love how they leaned into the dorky aspects of Leonardo's personality, and unlike Mikey's crush on April in the 2014 film, Leo's crush is endearing and wholesome. Raph in this movie is essentially Raphael from the 1987 animated series if he was allowed to be unapologetically violent, and it makes him so fun. Although Donnie doesn't stand out as much as the other two, he is incredibly sassy and sarcastic throughout, and his obsession with K-pop and anime feels very on brand for Donatello. And then we get to Michelangelo.
What do you do again? I bring a certain je ne sais quoi.
It's okay, Mikey, you're allowed to say you're the most boring Michelangelo. I'd appreciate your honesty. There's nothing about Mikey in this film that makes him unlikable, but he doesn't stand out in any other way. His personality basically just boils down to him being nice. The movie does try to tell us what makes Mikey special toward the end when Leo is listing his brother's strengths.
What do you do better than anyone, even Mark Ruffalo?
Improvise.
But this is something we don't ever see highlighted in the movie beyond him signing up for improv comedy and all of the improvisation he does alongside his brothers. And that is ultimately the issue when it comes to the turtles in this film. As a group, they are an absolute delight and have such good energy when they play off of one another. However, this means we don't really see them shine on their own. Sure, there are little moments that showcase their personalities, but we don't really get to see what they're like independent of one another. Fortunately, it seems like Tales of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is going to take the time to explore them individually when they are separated from one another, so I'm hopeful we'll get a better sense of these turtles. Especially Mikey, because Lord knows he needs it. April and Splinter are also really solid interpretations of their characters. I especially enjoy Splinter's arc as an overprotective parent learning that he's being controlling by seeing himself paralleled in Superfly. I don't like how Splinter is a random rat that just decided
I needed to find a way to unlock ancient secrets of ninjutsu
for no apparent reason. Part of me wonders if this line was a victim of the rewrites and there was previously an explanation as to why he specifically picked ninjutsu, but I'm not sure. The overall story of the turtles wanting to be accepted and prove themselves as heroes is at the core of the film the entire time, which keeps the story focused in a way that some other films on this list struggle with. As for some of my other issues with this movie, some of the humor and jokes just don't work particularly well. For one, the puke girl scene was completely unnecessary, and we didn't need a 30-second demonstration for us to understand that April threw up on camera. Plus, not actually showing it would have made her puking at Channel 6 have more of an impact. The milking joke was also an odd choice. I don't find it an insufferable bit by any means, I just don't find it particularly funny. And of course, this movie is chock full of pop culture references. This alone isn't necessarily an issue, because if we look at previous TMNT films, especially the 90s films, pop culture references were a huge part of storytelling. However, in Mutant Mayhem's case, a lot of the references feel a bit forced, and in some cases, already haven't aged well.
Drake! That guy's the goat of all time.
The reference that actually makes me cringe every time is the line about Mark Ruffalo in Endgame, because it is completely forced and adds nothing to the conversation. However, not all of the pop culture references bother me, I just think they went a little ham with them at times. I overall loved this movie on the rewatch, and I can't wait to see what else they do with these turtles in Tales of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and in the movie sequel. Moving into our top 3, in third place is Turtles Forever from 2009. This movie is incredibly influential for obvious reasons. It is the first on-screen crossover between different TMNT universes and establishes the Turtleverse, confirming that every iteration of TMNT that exists is canon to the same multiverse. It's hard to talk about in detail what makes Turtles Forever so incredible, because it ultimately boils down to all the little interactions between the characters and their counterparts. It's pretty well known that Shredder and Krang from the 1987 animated series are my favorite part of the entire franchise, and seeing them interact with the menace to society that is Utrom Shredder is done incredibly well. Hun is one of my favorite characters from the 2003 series, so having him as the secondary antagonist of this movie is very exciting. The bit with Hun getting fed up with 1987 Raphael repeatedly breaking the fourth wall is hilarious.
Some people just can't handle change.
Why do you keep doing that? Who are you talking to? There's no one there!
And of course, just seeing all 12 of the turtles featured in this film interacting with one another is iconic. But of course, I have to address the elephant in the room, that is the depiction of the 1987 Turtles. My biggest issue with this movie is a sentiment shared by most other TMNT fans, and that is that the 1987 Turtles feel a bit overly ridiculous at times. The best example of this is the bit where they keep noogieing Mikey, when that is something they have never done in the 1987 series. While for the most part their obsession with pizza isn't far off from canon, there are a couple of points where they act like it's all they think about, which isn't the case. Plus, them running to cry to 2003 Raph at one point is kind of insulting. However, their depiction is not nearly as bad as a lot of people make it out to be, and is more accurate than not. Individually, the 1987 Turtles feel incredibly accurate to their portrayal in the original series. One of my favorite scenes in this movie is the two Donatellos trying to build a portal generator together and how their different perspectives come together. Honestly, the character that irritates me the most in this movie is actually 2003 Raph. He's incredibly rude and pessimistic about the 1987 Turtles throughout the entire movie, and while that isn't entirely out of character, it's really obnoxious. Some people take issue with the Turtles sounding too different from the original voice actors, but for nearly every character, they sound incredibly close to what they actually sound like in the series. Raphael's voice actor especially did a phenomenal job at replicating Rob Paulsen's performance. The only voice that really sticks out to me in a bad way is Leonardo's, but every single voice actor in this movie feels closer to their original voice than any of the replacement voice actors on the actual 1987 show. I could gush about all of the little moments that make this movie so fantastic, but it would probably take forever and would be more boring than just going and watching the movie yourself. So if you haven't, do yourself a favor and watch Turtles Forever. You will not be disappointed by this absolute love letter to the franchise. And the end of this movie is absolutely adorable and made me cry the first time I saw it. In second place is the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles film from 1990. This movie is an absolute classic and beloved among TMNT fans for very good reason. This film takes a different approach to the Turtles, adopting the more serious tone we see in the original comics, but maintaining the lighthearted goofiness that is present in the cartoon. This incredible balance of tone is made apparent by the excellent character dynamics, in particular the emphasis on family. The main plot of the film centers around the Turtles trying to rescue Splinter after he's been kidnapped by the Foot Clan, and throughout the story we not only see their bond with him as their father, but with each other as brothers. Although Splinter primarily fills the role of the damsel in distress and feeding the viewer exposition, the moments we do see of him interacting with his sons are not only loving but lighthearted. He's not afraid to goof around and join in on the Turtles' shenanigans. The campfire scene is another great example of how important the bond between Splinter and the Turtles is, and the way it allows them them to forge this spiritual connection. The brotherly dynamic between the turtles is also showcased quite well with the subtle interactions between them, including physical affection and lighthearted insults. Raph and Leo's argument in April's apartment highlights the routine of their arguments by Mikey and Don going to the kitchen to watch while they eat snacks. This scene emphasizes both the seriousness and stress of the situation while simultaneously showcasing the ways in which Mikey and Don have found ways to cope with humor. April O'Neil and Casey Jones also contribute significantly to the enjoyment of this film. Although the father-son and brother dynamics are the primary focus for this movie, we also get to see the way they play off of their human allies in an endearing way. April graciously welcomes the turtles into her home when theirs is destroyed and offers the old farmhouse as a place to recuperate when Raph recovers. I really enjoy the way Casey Jones plays into their dynamic as well, bickering with April and fixing up the car with Donatello while they insult each other alphabetically. April is a very headstrong and independent individual and has several moments throughout the film that make her a really enjoyable character.
Get in here!
Timely.
107, a new record.
My personal favorite character from this movie is Casey Jones. The film does a great job highlighting his himbo energy without devaluing him as an ally. The fight with Raph is very iconic and has one of the best lines in the franchise.
Class is Pain 101. Your instructor's Casey Jones.
We also see him being a bit dorky with the little fist pump he does after he gets the foot ninja disguise and while he kisses April, plus this dramatic little hair tuck toward the end of the movie. And we can't forget the absolutely metal moment of him accidentally activating the garbage truck when Shredder falls into it. All of these character dynamics paired with the emotional yet lighthearted narrative is what makes this movie so memorable and iconic. Not to mention the incredible fight choreography and cinematography that ties the whole thing together. But of course, this film is not without its issues. For the most part, the pacing of this movie is really solid. They managed to cover a lot of story in a short period of time without making it feel rushed or choppy. However, there are absolutely some weird moments where the pacing just feels off. I think the best example of this is after Raphael is thrown through the window and the turtles realize they have to fight off the foot, instead of immediately jumping into a full-out battle, they have a bit where Mikey has a nunchuck off with one of the Foot Clan members. The bit itself is fun, but when it is immediately after this huge dramatic moment where Raph is nearly dead, it really breaks the urgency of the situation. There's also a weird moment where Tatsu starts throwing a tantrum for no reason and beats up this random kid, which serves as motivation for Danny to start questioning his affiliation with the Foot, but Tatsu's reason to start throwing things everywhere is not apparent at all. By far, my biggest issue with this movie is the Shredder. It feels like they were trying to set up the Shredder as this big mystery, but the payoff at the end just felt very lacking. When Splinter is explaining the story of Hamato Yoshi and Oroku Saki, Danny asks what happened to Saki, and Splinter replies,
"No one really knows."
Even though the Shredder was interrogating him earlier. You could maybe argue that he didn't recognize him yet, but nothing substantial happens prior to Splinter calling out the Shredder for being Oroku Saki on the rooftop. Speaking of, the final rooftop confrontation feels very anticlimactic to me. First of all, when the Shredder appears, he just stands there awkwardly and talks dramatically to the turtles. I think what makes this moment even more awkward is the turtles didn't even know that this guy existed, and now he's talking this big game about defeating them or whatever. The fight itself is boring to me as well, since the turtles only attack him one at a time and get absolutely destroyed by him before Splinter shows up and just flips him off the roof. It just feels very flat to me and could have been handled a lot better. That said, Casey with the garbage truck does somewhat save this finale for me. Overall, the 1990 live action film is phenomenal and definitely sets a standard for storytelling in the TMNT universe. What I believe to be the best film in the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles franchise is Batman vs. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles from 2019. This movie is absolutely slept on. Not a lot of people have watched it compared to the other films, but I have only ever heard positive things from the people that have seen it, and this is for very good reason. All of the characters in this movie are an absolute delight, and the way that they interact with one another is phenomenal. The way each of the members of the Bat family interacts with the Turtles is so much fun. Batgirl and Donnie's relationship is adorable. I love how Raph and Mikey interact with Robin and how he eventually warms up to them, and Alfred's dynamic with Mikey is probably my favorite of the bunch. And Batman letting Mikey's ADHD run wild and letting him press all the buttons in the Batmobile is iconic.
Michelangelo, press some buttons.
My only big issue with this movie is the third act breakup where Batman tells the Turtles they need to go home because they screwed up their mission. It feels forced and is resolved almost immediately. That said, it does give Raph and Robin a chance to shine, which I do really enjoy. Outside of their interactions with the Batman characters, this version of the Turtles is incredibly solid. Leo gets a really cool little arc where he faces his biggest fear of losing his brothers and has to confront his anger. Raph has his little speech in the scene with Batman that I just mentioned, and Donnie is the perfect mix of everything I love about Donatello throughout the franchise. I personally relate to Donatello a lot, and Batman vs. Donnie is the one I relate to most. But then we get to the best character in the movie, and who I would argue is the best interpretation of this character in the entire Turtleverse, and that is Michelangelo. Mikey alone is a huge reason this movie is so high on this list because he is delightful for the entire film's run. He's adorable, he's funny, and he's the perfect representation of what Michelangelo tends to be. If I could, I would put a compilation of every single Mikey moment in this movie that I love, but here's just a quick sample.
Who's got a gun umbrella? A gunbrella? How cool is that? He's awesome! Unless he's a bad guy. That'd make him like 40% less awesome. I'm Batman, and I'm riding a T-Rex, and I've never been so happy in my entire life!
The combat in this movie is also fantastic. The fight between Shredder and Batman toward the beginning of the movie is insanely fun to watch because of how evenly matched they are, and the entire Arkham sequence is awesome too. I really enjoy how we discover Ra's al Ghul's and Shredder's ultimate goal alongside the heroes when Batman is mutated by the Joker. Speaking of, the mutated Arkham inmates are really cool. Some of the designs are kind of basic, but others like Poison Ivy and Two-Face are badass. I think highlighting the Batman rogues in this way showcase the Batman universe without making the entire movie feel cluttered for its entire runtime. They essentially serve as cameos while allowing Ra's al Ghul and Shredder to remain the primary focus and main antagonists. We also get some nods to the TMNT universe like the Party Wagon and the inclusion of Baxter Stockman that help tie these two universes together. Like with the 1990 film, this movie moves fast to fit the whole story that it wants to tell while making sure it doesn't feel rushed and keeps the audience engaged. If you are a fan of either Batman or TMNT, I would absolutely recommend checking this movie out. It's so much fun and easily my favorite of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles films. Here is my final ranking of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles films. Let me know what you think and which of the TMNT movies is your personal favorite. All 10 of these films bring something fun and unique to the franchise, so if there are any you haven't seen, I would absolutely recommend giving them a watch. I'm filming this prior to the release of Tales of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles on Paramount+, so I'm not sure if this video will be out by August 9th. So if my review of that series is not out by the time you're seeing this, it will be coming out very, very soon. Thank you for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.